I'm James Allison, I'm the Technical Director for the team, and I'm here to answer your questions about the Hungarian Grand Prix. Two good starts from Mercedes cars saw us in P1 and P2 at the first corner, with the Ferraris pursuing behind, with Vettel at the lead of those two Ferraris. Stayed that way until about lap 15 when Raikkonen came in the pits, forcing us to have to follow with Valtteri in order to not be undercut by the second Ferrari. That left Vettel an opportunity to try and pursue Lewis, who was a few seconds up the road at that stage. Unfortunately for Vettel, he wasn't actually able to make any inroads onto Lewis's lead because both cars were very evenly matched at that stage of the race. And by the time the final stops played out in what was a one-stop race for most cars, we saw that Vettel came out behind Valtteri Bottas, who was trying a very, very long final stint in order to make a one-stop stick. And he was able, Valtteri, to hold that position in second place until the dying laps of the race, where his tyres ran out of road and Vettel and Kimi were both able to stream past him. Unfortunately, Valtteri actually suffered some small damage by bumping into Sebastian as Sebastian passed him, and that meant that he also ended up losing a place to Ricciardo too. So the final result was that we finished in first place with a comfortable drive from Lewis, and in fifth place from Valtteri, who'd driven an utterly brilliant and valiant race, but we asked him just a little bit too much from rubber that couldn't go that really long final stint. To Nathan on Instagram, thank you for your question. You asked, first of all, were we only on UltraSofts at the start in order to get a good getaway? And you asked the second question, which was how did Lewis actually manage to make them last so long? Well, we were on the UltraSofts at the start of the race to make a good start. We had a free choice because of yesterday's weather conditions. We could have gone soft, we could have gone UltraSoft. In part, it was to get a good start, but also because most of our strategic simulations showed that that was the best way for us to ensure that we had a good result at the end of the race. And how did we make them last as long as we did, or how did Lewis do that? It's a mixture of two things. First of all, we got a car that looks after its tyres quite well, was set up well to look after those tyres, but also we have a driver with very delicate feet who was able to make sure that he didn't break traction, was looking after the tyres, was controlling their temperatures, and therefore extending their life as far as possible, while also being pretty quick. To the intriguingly named Team Hamilton on Twitter, who asks, if Vettel had managed to jump Valtteri, would he have A, caught Lewis, and B, would he have been able to pass him on the much fresher UltraSoft compared with Lewis's used soft at that stage? Well, I don't think he would have been able to, is my answer. The reason for that is if you look at what happened when Vettel came out behind Valtteri. He didn't jump him. When he came out behind Valtteri, Vettel was on brand new UltraSofts at that stage, and Valtteri was on quite well-used softs. He was on 20 lap or so old softs at the time. And he presented no threat at all to Valtteri until Valtteri got up somewhere near 50 laps old on his soft tyres. So extremely difficult to see how after he came out of the pits and spent 20 laps or so catching Lewis, had he been able to, that he would have had anything like the sort of performance differential needed to overtake Lewis later in the race. To Ben on Instagram, thank you for your question, asking whether or not we considered whether or not to stop Lewis under the second virtual safety car to put on a fresh set of UltraSoft tyres to make sure that we were well protected against Vettel from behind. And you asked whether the gap was even big enough to consider such a thing in any case. Well, the gap was big enough, and we did consider it. We continually consider what to do, whether to be a safety car or a virtual safety car. But we concluded that his threat from behind was not sufficient, even on his used rubber, to justify such a move. And so we would not have done it, even though the gap was big enough to allow it. To James on Facebook, thank you for your question, where you asked whether it would have helped Valtteri's race to have stopped him for fresh UltraSofts under that final virtual safety car. Well, it would have done, there's no doubt about that, it would have done if the virtual safety car was guaranteed to have lasted long enough for us to make the stop. At the time, we were holding what felt like a risky second place, where we thought we might be able to get to the end, but we were not certain, and we felt that the likely worst case scenario was that we would come home fourth. So we might well have considered trading that risky second place for a nailed-on third, because we had the space to do it and get out ahead of Raikkonen. We might have considered it if we could be confident that that virtual safety car would have lasted long enough for us to complete the change. Trouble was, the car that had brought out the virtual safety car was stopped right by a gap in the barriers, and it was only going to take a matter of seconds for the marshals to pull that car off the track, and then the virtual safety car would have ended. It would have been bad for us to find ourselves in the no man's land where we had started a virtual safety car stop, but it ended up being halfway between a full stop and a virtual safety car stop because of the virtual safety car ending halfway through. So in the end, we decided to cling on for our risky second place strategy, thinking that worst case we would finish fourth. As it happens, the second place didn't work out, and it ended up a little worse for Valtteri and for us as a result of those collisions, meaning that in the final analysis he dropped down to fifth place behind Ricciardo. But we did consider it, and that's why we didn't do it. To Ben on Twitter, thanks for your question asking if Valtteri could have stayed out longer on his first stop, thereby giving him less of a stint at the end of the race, protecting him more at the end of the race where he had all his difficulties. Well, in hindsight, yes, we could have done. Whether or not we could have stayed out long enough to have made a difference is another question altogether. Kimi was a few seconds behind Valtteri when he made his first stop of the day. So we had a small amount of breathing space. We didn't have to react the lap later. And then we had a bit more breathing space by the fact that Kimi's pit stop was actually quite slow. So, although we did choose to react quite quickly, we contemplated for a little while pushing out another couple of laps and making it more of a tight thing to Kimi to prevent him undercutting us. We contemplated it, but in the end we rejected it because we thought, well, we too might have a bad pit stop. And what we definitely don't want to do is lose the position to Kimi by pushing our luck too far. So arguably we were a little conservative. Arguably we could have had a couple more laps on that first stint, and then as a result of that been a little bit less exposed at the end of the race. But the reality is that we lost the rubber with about 6 or 7 laps to go, and those 2 laps wouldn't have made any difference. The other thing to consider is that one of the reasons that Valtteri was able to be out in front of Sebastian at that crucial phase in the race where Sebastian made his own stop is that he had had a couple more laps racing on the fresher rubber that he then changed to, that meant he was that much further up the road. It would have been probably very unlikely that we would have been able to be ahead of Vettel when Vettel made his stop had we used those 2 extra laps earlier in the race. So it's always a swings and roundabouts thing and never quite as obvious as it looks at first glance. To Carl on Facebook, who asks whether everyone back here at the factory keeps working through the summer break or whether we also get a holiday. Well, most of us thankfully do get a holiday. There are a few dozen people here who keep working all the way through the summer break because the rules permit that. We're allowed to do maintenance work, we're allowed to do infrastructure upgrades, and certain parts of the company, like the commercial departments and the legal departments, are allowed to keep working, and so they do. But the large majority of the team, both the travelling part of the team and the factory part of the team, are taking a very, very well-earned and much looked forward to break before we come back to hit it all again in Spa in a few weeks' time. To Jody on Facebook, who asks where the relative strengths and weaknesses of the Ferrari and the Mercedes are at this point in the season and whether we're locked into that pattern for the remainder of the year. Well, it's a little tough to say because it tends to vary a little bit track to track, race to race, and as the development race has ebbed and flowed through the season, but there are a few patterns that are relatively constant. So certainly for a few races now, we have been missing just a few horsepower to a Ferrari that has had a very, very impressive rate of development through the year. We're probably on average better than Ferrari through the corners at most tracks. Sometimes they take a bit from us in the low speed, but medium and high speed we normally prosper relative to them. I would say they have tended to be a wee bit stronger than us when it's at tracks that are strongly rear limited. but we're talking small margins here, and us the opposite. We have tended to have better pit stops. They've tended to have better starts, although we appear to have put that right in recent races with a lot of work from the good guys in the controls department here in the factory. These are all small margins, which is why the championship has yo-yoed one way and the other. And it's quite interesting to note that in the 12 races we've had so far, only 5 of them have actually been won by the car that most people would agree was quickest on that weekend. 7 of them have been won against the head. 3 of them we've stolen, 2 of them Ferrari have stolen, and 2 Red Bull have had. So it's been a very, very intriguing year where these very small differences, maybe an error, maybe a moment of particular genius, or just sheer good fortune or ill fortune, is what is determining who comes home smiling at the end of the race. So none of it's set in stone. The development race over the remainder of the season, who stays strong, who doesn't make mistakes, who can keep their chin up the longest, and all the cliches you want to roll out, that is actually what is going to determine this utterly compelling and brilliant year. And none of us know, and none of our opposition know, who it's going to favour. And that's what makes it so exciting. Frightening too, but it's what makes us look forward to this second part of the year, to see whether it can be us that are standing at the end of the year with smiles on our face, knowing that we did a really good job in a season that put us to the test like no other. Thank you to all of you for all the questions today about the Hungarian Grand Prix. We'll be back after the summer break to answer a whole bunch more after what I'm sure will be an enthralling and an exciting Belgian Grand Prix.